corporation. There's the same sense of a steady nerve prime minister and inspector of buildings. He is modern man, with all his subtlety and complexity. The figures in Boston, and during the last war, when the Americans feared a bomb attack, the director of the museum, before putting him into the vaults, dressed him in modern clothes and had him photographed to show that man had not changed much in 4,500 years. The village mayor, found in the tomb of Ka-Apa at Saqqara, is a little more localized to the eastern Mediterranean. You might interview him in his Cairo office today, and you might meet the rather odious Prince Ra-Hotep in the streets. Even the famous scribe in the Louvre, although more idealized, is an individual portrait. And here I may digress to say that the word scribe is misleading. This was the accepted way of representing a civil servant. And the large number of figures in this pose is an indication of the vast importance of the bureaucracy in early Egypt. The early Egyptian interest in humanity was not confined to councillors and civil servants. From almost the first, they began to do small figures of ordinary people at work. Here are two of the first. And you see that, as well as being beautiful pieces of small sculpture, they show a touching sensibility to the character of the actual workers. In the ancient world, this response to ordinary working people is uniquely Egyptian. One wouldn't expect to find it in Babylonian or Syrian art, but it doesn't exist in Greece either. Working people were slaves whose activities were not worth recording, except as comic characters in drama. However, I must admit that the grandest and most confident of all Egyptian portraits goes a little further. This portrait of Pharaoh Khephren must be the noblest effigy of a ruler ever made. This feeling of composure and indestructible self-confidence lasted 700 years, much longer than the Roman Empire. Then there was a social revolution, darkness and destruction, which, to judge from the few surviving documents, seems to have been like the Dark Ages in Western Europe. The lights came on again in the period known as the Middle Kingdom, but Egypt had lost some of its confidence. The portraits of the pharaohs become more thoughtful. They show a vie intérieure, a discovery of melancholy, of the burden of the soul, very different from the bouncing heartiness of the Old Kingdom. Ra, the simple extrovert god of the sun, becomes less representative than Osiris, god who was murdered by his brother and resurrected, the god who presided over the dead. Egypt once more established a great empire, but one sees in this little chapel of Sesostris how much more complex and tender was Pharaoh's relationship with the gods. Almost every relief shows Sesostris drawing inspiration and spiritual strength from the physical potency of the god. And above the reliefs are these panels of the most beautiful hieroglyphics. I think almost the most beautiful of the whole of Egyptian art. These reliefs also show what was to become one of the most life-enhancing achievements of Egyptian art, the cult of physical beauty. This Middle Kingdom lady is already a sort of Mona Lisa, only more appealing to our eyes. And a little later, my goodness, what beauties. These men and girls in the tomb of Ramose are actually early New Kingdom, but they are descended from almost equally beautiful grandmothers. Was there ever such elegance and refinement? Perhaps in the Kore of 6th century Greece, or among the Gothic Madonnas. And the longer you look at them, the more you realize that, like the Greek Kore, they're all subtly different from one another. The anxiety that one sees in the portraits of the Middle Kingdom was justified. Egyptian civilization collapsed again, this time from external invasion, and once more renewed itself. A series of warrior pharaohs adopting the new weapon of the chariot drove out the invaders and established a great empire. This was the so-called New Kingdom, new in the year 1590 BC. It's not as creative nor as human as the Old Kingdom, but architecture reached new heights of magnificence. This is Hatshepsut's temple in the hills near Thebes. It's worth remembering that this is of the same date as the ferocious beginnings of Chinese art. Before these pillars, one can't help exclaiming once more, how Greek! It's over 1,000 years before the Parthenon. But in 1378 BC, there took place the strangest incident in Egyptian history, the reign of the man who came to be known as Akhenaten and who changed the state religion. There are two conflicting types of portrait of Akhenaten. This one, a sensitive, intelligent face like a Botticelli, or perhaps the death mask of Keats. The other, more idiosyncratic, a long, attenuated head where the sensitivity borders on neurasthenia. And he still excites conflicting feelings, Some Egyptologists call him an overrated crank or fanatic. Others call him a religious genius and the first individual in history. I think the last proposition is true. He was determined to bring Egypt back to the worship of a single god, which he believed had been the practice of the Old Kingdom. The god was called Ra-Atan, the sun, and there was already a considerable following for his worship in Heliopolis. But Akhenaten did it with a passionate single-mindedness that very seldom works in public affairs. He built a new capital of the empire and called it Akhenaten, and he gave up his life and that of his beautiful and intelligent queen Nefertiti to worshipping the sun. The large ritualistic figures of him, like this one in Cairo, made older historians speak of him as a misshapen epileptic. And I confess it is rather disturbing. I think it must contain some part of the truth, because these wonderful sculpture sketches of him suggest the same kind of quasi-hysterical face. There must have been some genetic oddity, because his daughters, whose likenesses we know from these exquisite small sculpture sketches, have the same very odd-shaped heads. Incidentally, Akhenaten was one of the very few pharaohs whose parents were not related. But his wife, Nefertiti, was never caricatured in this way, and remains the most beautiful woman who has come down to us from the past. Whatever else his religious convictions may have done, they had a liberating effect on art. He allowed himself and his family to be portrayed with unprecedented intimacy. Here he is embracing one of his daughters, far from the formal pose of a pharaoh. After his death, although craftsmanship remained unsurpassed, this is his daughter and son-in-law Tutankhamun, inspiration vanished, along with the worship of the single god. Akhenaten was also a poet whose hymn to the sun has come down to us in an inscription. It has an astonishing likeness to the hymn to the sun by the greatest religious genius of medieval Christianity, St. Francis. Bright is the earth when thou risest in the horizon, all trees and plants flourish. The birds flutter in their marshes, their wings uplifted in adoration of thee. The sheep dance upon their feet, all winged things fly, they live when thou hast shone upon them. The chicklet crieth in the eggshell, thou givest him breath therein to preserve him alive. When thou hast perfected him, that he may pierce the egg, he cometh forth to chirp with all his might. O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom thou hast made them all. The earth is full of thy creatures. That last versicle is from the 104th Psalm, but it is almost word for word the same as some other lines in Akhenaten's hymn. And of course, it raises the question whether the monotheism of Akhenaten could be the origin of the monotheism of the Jews. Unfortunately, the captivity of Israel in Egypt, which is the linchpin of Jewish history and religion, seems to have left no impression at all on the Egyptians. No mention of a Semitic vizier called Joseph, no mention of the 10 plagues, no mention of Moses, not even a hint. We can't guess to within 500 years when the whole episode took place. The first indisputable mention of Israel in an Egyptian document occurs just over 1,000 years after the death of Akhenaten. It is tempting to believe that the Jews took Akhenaten's monotheism with them to the desert of Sinai, and thus that the spiritual enlightenment of Akhenaten that failed so disastrously in his own country was ultimately to become the faith of the Western world and of Islam. But I fear that it's no more than a historian's dream. And in fact, the greater part of Judaic literature is far more Mesopotamian in spirit than Egyptian. Akhenaten's experiment was bound to fail. The Egyptian empire was overstretched and needed a man of action to defend it. Previous pharaohs had kept their positions by balancing the powers of the army and the priesthood, and Akhenaten had defended them both. They managed to get rid of him. Exactly how, we don't know. They razed his capital to the ground and moved the court back to Thebes, the great center of the cult of Amun. There followed the great centuries of Egyptian imperialism. The three pharaohs called Ramesses were warriors and conquerors. In a sense, the creative element of Egyptian civilization was lost. Imperialism involves uniformity, bureaucracy, military castes, all the things that are hostile to original genius. We've reached the age of gigantic temples. This is the entrance to the Luxor temple with its inevitable obelisk, one of a pair which the other is in the Place de la Concorde. The great courtyard is really one of the most beautiful pieces of Egyptian architecture. It is considerably bigger than any European cathedral, but it's quite small and modest compared with the gigantic complex of Karnak. What a place. As one walks between these serried rows of rams, much too close together, and approaches the enormous entrance, one feels alternately crushed and elated. The Hall of Columns is one of the wonders of the world, but no camera can give any idea of its size and complexity. It's said that over 100 men can stand on the top of each of these pillars. There are 122 of these enormous columns, with 12 even bigger ones down the middle, about 70 feet high. And how thick? Well, you can see when I try to put my hands around them. We are told that the whole of Canterbury Cathedral could be fitted into this single hall. Originally, the columns were rough, like the two end ones, but they were smooth and faced with a stone which allowed for a special kind of relief carving with a deep incision all round the outlines to give them carrying power. These reliefs are, for the most part, very able pieces of sculpture. No, more than able, impressive by their combination of energy and a sense of beauty. The dominant sweep of Ramesses II's shoulder, contrasting with his crown, is a splendid, vigorous, formal invention. And what a classical beauty he is. And yet, after an hour or two, these reliefs become exhausting, even oppressive. And after walking around the whole enormous area, one begins to feel, oh, not another relief, for Pete's sake. The reason? Because they are propaganda, repeated as relentlessly as propaganda in Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia, although with a good deal more art. If repetition was the essence of propaganda, they certainly achieve it. And Ramesses' propaganda image spread everywhere, even as far as Abu Simbel. One could call Ramesses II the Napoleon of Egypt, the insatiable conqueror obsessed by la gloire. His tomb has been rifled as usual. Only his mummy was left, and as you see, he lived a good deal longer than Napoleon, almost as long as Mr. Rockefeller. He built himself a funerary temple, considerably larger and grander than Napoleon's tomb in Les Invalides. It contains some magnificent fragments and the usual reliefs, and one of these shows Ramesses the Conqueror with his horse-drawn chariots causing indescribable confusion in the enemy. One looks at it without much sympathy. And then one turns one's head and sees this gigantic figure fallen to the ground, but still majestic. Here's the shoulder, and over there is the ruined head. The whole thing is said to have weighed over 1,000 tons. And walking round it, one realizes what an amazing sense of form the Egyptian sculptors retained even in this age of authoritarianism. One mightn't have liked the figure so much when it was standing upright. On its side, it's a magnificent piece of abstract sculpture. Well, eventually the tide of history turned and swallowed Egypt, as it has done all civilizations. Is there anything for us to learn from it besides the nostalgic pleasure of looking at these great ruins? I think there is. I'm standing between two of the most famous monuments of Egyptian art, the so-called Colossi of Memnon. Every early traveler visited them, including the Emperor Hadrian, who had a eulogy inscribed on one of their knees. Throughout all these centuries, the colossi used to rise out of green grass. When I first saw them, there were little black goats skipping round them in the grass. Now, the famous high dam, built out of the noblest motives, has prevented the Nile from carrying down its silt, so instead of grass there is mud. The double-edged sword of technology has ruined a natural process that had worked perfectly for 5,000 years. Surely there is a lesson for us in this. The long triumph of Egypt depended on her respect for the natural order of things, the yearly return of the life-giving waters of the Nile. The civilization of the Old Kingdom was based on renewal, the husbanding of nature, not, as ours has been, on a greedy expansion and exploitation of resources. Nowadays we're told that it's discreditable to look backwards and try to find inspiration in the arts and beliefs and moral standards of the past. We're told that man has changed. Well, he hasn't. And nor has woman. Technology, although it may ruin us, is not going to remove our deep-seated need for order and harmony, or the feeling of sympathy for our fellow creatures, both human and animal, or the belief, for which we have no rational grounds, that some part of us is immortal. These ideas first found expression 5,000 years ago. And even if they are lost for a time, we can renew them, as the Egyptians did.